To your mind?
Football, baseball.
Baseball?
Oh, there you go. Good.
I know Dale would think baseball. He's been there. He loves baseball. Some might even think one of the places Anna wants to go to is the National Women's Hall of Fame, which is up in New York. There's a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I heard is close by. It's in Cleveland. Sounds like a cool road trip. But the one Hall of Fame when I think of the Country Music Hall of Fame. And the reason is, a couple years ago, Dale and I went to Fort Campbell to visit one of our chaplains. He's retired since, but Kirsten and Jeff Botsford, who are really good friends of ours, we went to see them, and we went down for a day to Nashville, and we got to walk around. I actually know what a honky-tonk is now. Been well educated. We went to the Country Music Museum and Hall of Fame. And it was a really interesting trip because I grew up in a home that country music was kind of frowned on. I like it now. I listen to it. And it was kind of interesting because as we were walking through the Hall of Fame and I saw the names and the pictures from back in the day, I realized I knew a lot of them. And it wasn't because I listened to the music, but because they were the popular. They were the most talented. They were even probably the prettiest of the stars, and everybody knew them. But there's a Hall of Fame that we should all know about, and it's a different Hall of Fame because humans don't get to choose who gets into that Hall of Fame. God is the one who picks the inductees, who puts them there. And it's interesting when you read this list. The list is in Hebrews 11. It's the great example of faith. And when you read the list of these people, there are really famous people, we know them, but there are also people who aren't even named. God doesn't pick the prettiest, He doesn't pick the most talented, He picks those who are faithful, who follow Him. Now, one thing you have to know about the list that is in chapter 11, according to the Wesleyan commentary writer, this is the list that chronicles the time between the creation and the first time Christ comes. And in my point of view, every day there is another person who's inducted, who has been faithful to God, and God welcomes him in. So I'm going to just explain. Let's just look at some of these people. And I'm not going to read the scripture. We're just going to tell you the stories. And some of them sound really odd. We have Abel. We all know the story of Cain and Abel, how their parents sinned and God told them what to sacrifice. And Abel went out and he did exactly what God asked him to do. His brother Cain didn't. And God considered Abel faithful. And God was pleased with what he did. God was not pleased with Cain. And Cain was angry, and we all know the story. The very first murder on earth was Cain killing Abel. And here's this person. We don't know the timeline. It wasn't a very long time for him to be faithful. But God has put him into this Hall of Fame. Here's one person you probably never heard of, and his name is Enoch. Now Enoch there's 2 verses, besides he's in a lot of genealogy lists, but there's only 2 verses that tell us who this man Enoch is. In Genesis 5:23 and 24 it said, Enoch lived 365 years. He walked in close fellowship with God. And then one day he disappeared because God took him. That is all we know about Enoch. Doesn't that sound like a really exciting guy for you? And then there's some famous one. We think of Noah, how faithful he was. He built his ark in the middle, in the middle of the land. And according to experts, I watch a lot of like Smithsonian's and Net Geo and all that, and they talk about this kind of stuff. They say that it was more like a greenhouse, the days of Noah. They didn't know what rain was.
Right, right.
And yet God called Noah and said, you're going to build this big ark, you're going to gather up all these animals. And Noah did exactly what God said to him to do. Can you imagine? He was faithful. How many people mocked him and picked on him? Because he wasn't near any rivers or anything. He was far away. And also think of the heartbreak he must have felt. He knew that he, his wife, his sons, and their wives were going to be the only people left on earth. Imagine heartbreak. His friends were going to die. His extended family were going to die. And he was going to be saved. And yet he was faithful in the end. Abraham and Sarah made this list. God called Abraham at 75 years of age to follow him. And Abraham and Sarah picked up everything they had and went and followed God. They had no clue where God was going to take them. God had promised Abraham that he was going to be a father of a great nation. But it took him 25 years to give him one son. And so God did what he promised. And one day God said to Abraham, it's time to go make a sacrifice. Take Isaac and wood and go sacrifice. And God was asking Abraham, he was giving Abraham a test to see how faithful Abraham was. And we know the story. He tied Isaac up and he took the knife, and at that moment the angel came and there was a ram for sacrifice. God wanted to see who Abraham was more faithful to. Joseph, he was faithful because every time that things looked really good and things were going to be awesome, they all fell apart. God gave Joseph all these dreams when he's young, and you know how young people are? You know when you're young, you get excited about the things that God's going to do for you and say to you. So he blabbed it, and his brothers got jealous, and they sold him as a slave. Now here's the thing. They didn't just sell him to anyone. They sold him to Ishmaelites, who were the extended family, because Joseph came from Isaac's line, and there was his stepbrother Ishmael. And so the Ishmaelites was part of Ishmael. So they were distant cousins, step cousins. They sold him to. But Joseph was faithful. He was so faithful that Potiphar put him in charge of everything. He was so faithful even when he was put in jail on a wrongly. He was still faithful and followed God, and God blessed him. Moses was a son of faithful parents. His parents loved him. When Moses was born, remember Pharaoh said you're supposed to kill all the manservants, all the male babies, and Moses' parents hid him because they knew there was something special and that God had a plan for him. And even when Moses got too old so they could hide him, his mother made a basket and put him safely into the Nile. And she had faith that God was going to save them. If you watch Net Geo Wild, you know that the Nile has a lot of crocodiles and hippopotamus, and those are the two most dangerous animals. And yet his mother knew that God was going to faithfully do. Moses was faithful when God met him at the burning bush, and God said, "This is what I want you to do." Moses got up and did it. And he directed people, and he was faithful. Only once did he lose his faithfulness, when he got mad and hit the rock. But God still let him see a glimpse of the promised land. Rahab was a prostitute, probably a prostitute, because the innkeepers in Bible times were women. And so they were mostly prostitutes. And so Rahab was known as an innkeeper, and she knew that the God of the children of Israel was something special. He was different. And so when the two spies came to Jericho, she hid them. And she knew that she could have faith in them. So when she let them go, she asked favor into letting these men would save her family when they came up and to destroy Jericho. And they did. They came and saved her. And just to let you know, Rahab didn't see what her faithfulness got her. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, you see her name among 5 women of ill reputes that are in the genealogy of Christ. She is one of them. There are a lot of unknown people in this chapter, and we knew that they were beaten, they were tortured, they died, and yet they went through this and did not deny God. They were so faithful to Him. And you know, sometimes when you're faithful to God doesn't mean you're going to be famous. We were just talking about this today on the van. Indiana Wesleyan does the pastor of the week. Dale is never going to be the graduate pastor, you know, the alumni pastor of the week, because he's at a small church. They're always at these really large churches. Being faithful to God is more important of what God is thinking about you than what others. What is faith? Hebrews 11:1 says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. You all had faith today when you came to Emmaus Road. How many of you got to your chair and you went like this or like this? We all sat down in a chair having faith that it would hold us, right? That is what faith is. And we can have faith in God. The thing that all these people who are listed in this chapter knew was they could have faith in God. And they're following God. They knew that God was going to be faithful back to them. We know that we can have faith, and it's important to God in our relationship with Him. Sometimes, though, the problem is when we read this chapter, we look at these Bible characters. We call them the heroes of the faith. And we put them up on pedestals. And we look at them and say, wow, there's no way I could have faith like them. They're just so awesome. But the one thing that God has given us is He has given us their true life. In the stories of the Bible, God could have hid all the problems, all their sins, but instead God put their dirty laundry in. Let's see some of these people. Abraham and Sarah were kind of concerned that God wasn't working fast enough, so he slept with Hagar. And we got Ishmael, and unfortunately we have all that problems in the Middle East because of their little mistake they did. And then we think of Noah. He got drunk and exposed himself to his children, so they all weren't good. Now, the one thing that really interests me when I was working on my sermon is that David didn't have his own bio. If you read the scripture in chapter 11, David is put in a group of people, in Joshua to the prophets. In Hebrews 11:32-35, we find David, who was the man after God's own heart. And it says, how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, the people overthrew the kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God has promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped the death by the edge of the sword. In their weakness was turned to strength, because they became strong in battle and put the whole army to flight. David, who was a man of God, he had an affair with a married woman. He schemed to hide that, brought her husband back from battle. When that didn't work, he put her husband on the front lines and pulled the rest of the army out, so he was a murderer too. And yet when he finally repented, God still called him a man of God. The remarkable thing about God is he takes imperfect people who are willing to follow him faithfully, and God empowers them to follow the plan he has for them. Now there are some things that every person probably in this chapter of the Bible would tell you. If you're sitting there and you're trying to think, well, and I know most of you have followed God faithfully, and you would understand and you know these things, but if there's someone here who is thinking, it might be okay, I may or may not want to follow God, here are some things that we can guarantee you, and every person in this Hall of Fame of Faith so far will tell you this. First thing we will find out is God is faithful. He always does what he promises his people. We need to remember that God works in his own timing, not human timing. A great example of this is after Adam and Eve sinned in chapter 3, verse 15 of Genesis, he promises the Messiah, and I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. The prophecy of Christ coming. How long did that promise it took to fulfill that promise? Centuries. Centuries and centuries of time. But it's interesting because God's timing is always perfect. We may not think that in our human views, but God's timing is. The second thing that we find out is God has a plan for each one of us. There's a book by the name of Jeremiah. He was one of those prophets that were unnamed. He was just thrown into the prophets. He was a prophet. And his job, God called him when he was really young. And sometimes, I think God gives us stories about these great heroes so we can relate to them during our lives. And Joshua sometimes I relate to because sometimes we end up in churches where there are people who are older than us. And we're like, God, we're trying to tell the people what you're telling us, but they're like, that's not the message, God, you're supposed to be telling. But Jeremiah was a prophet, and God's message that Jeremiah had to give to the people was he had to go to Judah, and the message was, God's told me to tell you, you stepped on his last nerve, and he's going to punish you. And so the problem was there was other prophets going around going, everything's fine, God's so happy with us. And so the people weren't too happy, and we know all the story. Babylon came down, not once, but many times. I just got finished reading the major prophets, and it's like, and Babylon came down and took more people and more stuff. And so there's a verse in Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah 29, verse 11. And it's kind of interesting because I see this verse a lot. And the story behind this is a message from God for the people, the exiles in Babylon. Mm-hmm. Not for us. We have to make sure we know the historical backgrounds. But it's also a great verse for us. And I'm going to go on because my son, if he sees this, he's going to call me and complain. The verse says, for I know I have the plan for you, say the Lord. And it was supposed to be a glimmer of hope for the exiles, and it's a glimmer of hope for us. And I see this a lot. Everybody on Facebook, you see, I know the plans I have for you. But somehow we forget there's two other verses that go with this verse. And really what it's saying is, for I know I have the plans for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good, not for disaster, to give you a future and to give you a future and a hope. And sometimes we just stop there. And it says, in those days when you pray, I will listen. And if you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. Sometimes when we talk about God's plan for us, we want to remember what's God's job. God has a plan for us, and it's to be great and wonderful. And sometimes we don't want to take the time to look at what our job is when it comes to God's plan. Amen. We are supposed to pray for it. We're supposed to look wholeheartedly, and we will find it. Now, sometimes God will not show his whole plan for our lives because we aren't going to be able to handle it.
I was going to say we can't.
We can't handle it. One of the things I told our church is, in 2009, I got a phone call from the Shenandoah district. They wanted me to be the Wesleyan Kids for Mission director. And Dale said, go for it. And so I went for it, and nobody told me that I was going to have to stand in front of the whole district and talk. And so I don't know how many, I think it was between 200 and 400 people. It looked like 1,000 to me. And I did it. The people laughed because a couple people say when I'm nervous and standing up there I was wiggling my foot. But if I would have known that back in United Wesleyan when I was taking speech class, where speech class was, I was like this. Tears were rolling down my face and I'm going, trying to get it. There was no way I would have done that. I would have said, God, you're nuts. But God has a plan for us. And sometimes we see a lot of it and sometimes we don't see a lot of it. The next thing that we find out about God is faithful to put all the pieces together. God is in charge of putting the pieces. James gets these really big $100 Lego sets. And when he empties out the bags of pieces, for me, it's overwhelming. Because you don't know how all the pieces go. And yet, James has the instruction. We don't have the instructions. God has the instructions. And luckily for us, he puts it away. Sometimes we're going to have to wait till the pieces are all put together in the right. In November of 1990, Dale and I were heading to the American Dream. We had just bought a house a couple months before. I was pregnant with our second child. Dale was climbing the ladder in this company called Daytimers. And we were leaders in our church. And we thought, hey, this is awesome. We're going to look like a successful couple. Well, one morning in November of 1990, it was a Friday. It was a warm Friday because it was out hanging out wash on the line. God interrupted our life. He called us into the ministry. At 10:30 that morning, God spoke to me in our little backyard. Our backyard was so little that Dale weed whacked it. We didn't have a lawnmower, we weed whacked it. And Dale was 20 more minutes east of us at Daytimers at his job. And our senior pastor, Dan Berry, was 20 minutes west of us. And at 10:30 that morning, he spoke to all three of us at the same time. And so Dale came home and he said, Pam, I think God's calling us into the ministry. And I sat there and he was talking about 10:30 and all this. I kept quiet because I grew up in the pastor home. And the last place I wanted to go back was the pastor's home. But it was kind of funny. So we sat down to eat. And all of a sudden the phone rang, and it was Dr. Berry, and he said, God spoke to me, and I think you guys are supposed to be in the ministry. And I said, okay, he talked to me too. Fine. The interesting thing about that was 1990. We had to wait till August of 93 till God was ready for our move to Indiana. Many, many times in our lives, Dale and I have sat and waited. And I think some of you guys know what that means. Waiting on God, waiting for His plan. And a great verse for those moments are, "Be still and know that I am God."
That's right.
Psalms 46:10. Be still. Unfortunately, sometimes as humans, we try to put the pieces together in our lives. Does that always work out? Most times we fall on our face and then we have to wait for God to fix everything, or we have to do it. The last thing that we can know and believe in God, that if you follow God faithfully and you follow the plan that you have for your life, you may never ever see that whole plan finish. Most of the people, all these people who are in this chapter in Hebrews 11, they never saw what God had promised. Abraham did not see his millions and millions of children, the nation that God had planned. We do know that Elijah got to see the end, and he went up in a chariot made of fire. Very few people get to see this. A good example of this is an event that happened in the 1950s. The story is about Nate Saint and Jim Elliot and 3 other missionaries who went to Ecuador. If you know the story, Shell Company went to get the oils, and other United States companies were going in, and Ecuador really needed the money. And so they were going to do anything to entice businesses to come. But there was one problem. There was a tribal people, and they were called by other tribes the savages. They were a primitive tribe, and they were men hunters, and they were killers, and just really, really mean. And they would go in and they would break the equipment, and they would kill people. People would just disappear. And Ecuador's solution was they were going to go and send the army and just wipe out these people. And Nate Saint and Jim Elliot and 3 other young missionaries, young men who could have done anything. They were brilliant. They had their whole futures in the palm of their hands. Decided to follow God and to go down to Ecuador, and they were going to minister to those people. Well, they went down, they took their families, their children, young children, and their wives, and they kept them safe somewhere, but every once in a while they flew to make contact, to start making contact with their tribes. And one day they did not return when they were supposed to. Their wives called the authorities, and they flew over a plane. And the pictures, if you go on the internet, you can see the pictures of the bodies. They took pictures of the bodies just floating in the water. These tribal people were using them as turtle bait, as their bodies. For most of us, we would have said, what a failure. In our human eyes, we would say, what a waste. They failed. They didn't do anything exciting. They didn't change the world to a better place. They didn't save these people. Well, years later, Elizabeth Elliot, the wife of Jim Elliot, felt a call to go back to the same people who killed her husband. And she took her young daughters and she ministered to this tribe. And a lot of them were saved. And not only to this tribe, but the tribe took them to other tribes and to other tribes. And she did a ministry, and when she got too old, she started praying for someone to come and to continue the ministry to the tribes in the Ecuador jungles. And her prayers were answered. A young man by the name of Steve Saint came. Steve is the son of Nate Saint. He has gone and ministered to the people who murdered his father. And these men who have murdered his father have become Christians, They are the elders of their church. They have decided to go and minister to the tribes. They're still working with the tribes around Ecuador's jungle. To this day, you want to talk about forgiveness. A great story is Steve Saint's children called the man who murdered his father grandfather, because now he is a great Christian. And so we, once again, we thought, what a waste. They just messed up. Maybe it wasn't what God wanted them to do, but it was only a beginning of what God had planned for those people, the tribes. As we think of living faithfully and we look at the verses, and I ask you, my homework is, and I always give my children homework, my homework is please read Hebrews 11. See what God said about these people who were great heroes of the faith. And like I said, this is just a small list of who's a part of that hall of faith. And so my question for you tonight is, when you die and you stand before God, will God tell you that you were faithful, that you are a new inductee into this Hall of Fame? And what will God say about you if that is true? Or will God look at you tonight, at that moment, and say, you were not faithful. I'm sorry, you will not be welcome into my Hall of Fame. This is a question that we all need as Christians to think about daily as we go on to our lives.